perfect introduction to what we're going to be doing here. The real questions that we want to raise all through this semester are the ones that Mayor Warren talked about. What do we want to spend our money on? What should we, what shouldn't we? How much should we involve the market and let the market do it? And how much do we want government to be involved? So as I told you, I have put together a bunch of slides to give us just some basic information. And I'm going to run through these very, very quickly. They're on the website tomorrow, so you'll be able to see them and download them if you wish. Then we're going to take, as we always do, about a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back and it's your show. Q&A for the rest of our period. So you'll be able to quiz both of us and quiz yourselves and give us some of your own opinions. So the real questions that we're going to be looking at this semester is, what do you want government to do? And I think you're going to find as the campaign unwinds, and you see the presumed 3 debates between Mr. Obama and Mr. Romney and one between Mr. Biden and Mr. Ryan, that this question is really going to be fundamental behind it. What do we want government to do, and what do we want government not to do? And that really also means, how much do you want to pay for it? Because that's going to be very important. We're going to get right to the question the mayor raised about deficits and debt in a few seconds. So here are the data for the current fiscal year, which began July 1st, on how we spend our money. At the very top, Social Security, about $825 billion that we spent this year on Social Security, followed by defense, about $700 billion. Income security programs, programs that involve the anti-poverty programs, programs of income assistance, food stamp programs, and so forth. Then the largest spending of all is actually, if you combine the 2 categories of Medicare, for those of my age and older, and some of you in the room, and our healthcare spending, which is now up to close to over $900 billion, closing in on $1 trillion. Net interest on our debt is about $250 billion this year. That's money we're spending of your tax dollars and mine to pay for things we bought years ago. Veterans benefits, about $140 billion, followed by federal programs of education, training, employment, and social services, about $122 billion. Notice much smaller than other things. And then you'll see transportation, our justice system, including the Attorney General's office and all the federal courts. We spend about about $60 billion on international affairs, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, AID programs, foreign aid that the mayor talked about $41 billion in natural resources and the environment, including our national parks, about $35 billion on community and regional development, about $31 billion on general science, NSF, NIMH, space programs, $2.3 billion to put the lander on Mars this summer, which I watched at 2 o'clock in the morning with fascination. About $26 billion just to support government agencies, agriculture about $25 billion, and energy 13. Commerce and housing credit actually comes out as a negative because of how we're unwinding Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. If you look at what changed the most between 2008, the fiscal year in which Mr. Obama was elected, and the current fiscal year, energy has gone from about $628 million to about $13.9 billion. Huge increase there. International affairs has doubled in 4 years. Veterans benefits are up by 2/3. Transportation is up by almost 50%. And then at the other end, you'll see that we've only increased spending on general science, space, and technology by about 17%, which many people in the academy and in science think is very worrisome about the future. Net interest has come down a little bit, mainly because interest rates are so very low, despite the fact that, as you'll see in a minute, our debt has increased. If you were to look at federal receipts and federal outlays, and by the way, all of these data come from the Council of Economic Advisors going back to 1964, and the years you'll see in all these charts coincide with the elections in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, 1968, Richard Nixon, 1972, Nixon again, then Ford, 1976, Jimmy Carter, 1980, Ronald Reagan. 1984, Ronald Reagan again. 1988, George Bush. 1992 and 1996, of course, Bill Clinton. 2000, the younger George Bush. 2004, Bush again. 2008, Obama, and now 2012. And what you see in this chart is that federal receipts, that's tax receipts and other forms of income that come into the federal government, and federal outlays tracked very smoothly together with outlays slightly greater than receipts, therefore small deficits, up through about 2000. Not 2008. The big difference between outlays and receipts began with the first of the George W. Bush administrations in 2000, well before the recession of 2007, began in December of 7. And then it just continues to explode as you see outlays rising and revenues stalling. Another way to put it is to take a look at the federal deficits. From 1964, tiny, 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 we're running $73, $75 billion deficits. Back in 1980, large deficits grow actually under President Reagan and the first Bush. Fascinating, big deficits. Then 1992, just on the eve of the election of Mr. Clinton, a budget deficit of almost $300 billion under a Republican. We then had a surplus during the administration of Bill Clinton, and then you will see large and growing deficits, although the government now expects the deficit will close in this fiscal year from what it was last year, as we cut back on spending. But of course, a lot of this will have to do with what happens with the so-called Bush tax cuts. Here's just another look at it. That line that says balanced budget, anytime you're above that black line that says balanced budget, you're running a deficit and adding to the national debt. The deficit is what you get in a given year. The debt is the cumulative deficits minus surpluses since essentially the founding of the country in 1787. The one time during this period of time that we had actual surpluses below the balanced budget line was 2000 to 2004 during the administration of Bill Clinton. Here's just another look at it. Here we have the surplus or deficit as a percent of gross domestic product. And you'll see that actually in 2013, when we're all worried about this huge deficit this year, and Mr. Romney and Mr. Ryan are talking about it every day, it's actually not much greater than it was in 1992 or 1984, or for that matter, 1976. Our GDP has grown dramatically, the deficit has grown, but as a share of GDP, this current fiscal year's budget deficit is actually not much larger than we've had in past times. And we should keep that in mind. This is not so extraordinary that we haven't seen deficits of this size before. Of course, the total debt has grown dramatically. It was about $256 billion, a quarter of $1 trillion in 1964. By 1980, in the election of Ronald Reagan, it was up to $712 billion. In the next 12 years, Reagan, Bush, won, it goes from $712 billion to $3 trillion. So Republicans have talked a lot about deficit reduction and how bad the debt is, but you should keep in mind that actually the fastest percentage growth in the debt that we've had since the 1960s actually occurred under conservative Republican presidents. Then fell because of the surpluses that Mr. Clinton ran, a Democrat, and then we saw an explosion in debt from $3.4 billion in fiscal 2000 to $5.8 trillion, again, under Republican President George W. Bush. And then the explosion to almost $13 trillion, mainly as tax revenues fell dramatically with the worst recession since the Great Depression, and our spending rose to try and stimulate the economy, as well as all the income security programs, federal unemployment insurance, and so forth. If you look at U.S. federal outlays, federal government outlays as a percent of gross domestic product, You'll see in 2008 it was about 21%. It's today about 25%, again with stimulus and a couple of wars that we're fighting. But you'll see that for the most part, federal spending has been about 21, 22% of GDP. For most of this period of time, it was lower during the Clinton administration, a Democrat. It's up to about 25%, the highest it's been over this period of time. Okay? I decided to take a look at how does the United States compare with the rest of the countries, or major countries, major developed countries. In this case, because countries have different federal systems, so if you just looked at federal taxes and federal spending, that would be misleading because some countries have a lot more state and local spending, like the United States, and other countries like Iceland, almost all their budget is federal. So I've added in state and local government here, and you'll see across countries, we're actually even, and this is for 2012, I should have noted that here, this is 2012, we still spend a relatively small proportion of our GDP on government. About 36%, a little over a third of all of our GDP goes through federal, state government, and the city of Newton. And a few other cities around the country. But if you compare that, Sweden, 54%, France, 53%, Hungary, 52%, Austria, 49%, Germany, 45%, Greece, 42%, Norway, 41%, etc. We are actually not very highly taxed. We don't actually have a very large government sector relative to most of the developed countries in the world, even at this point of time in which we spend a lot of money. The other thing is you have to make a distinction between what the government actually buys or invests in and how much government spending we have. So, for instance, the government buys F-22 fighter jets. The government buys computers. The government invests in highways when they repair Interstate 94. But that is direct spending. It doesn't include things like Social Security transfer payments or Medicare. Those are transfers, and they're not included here. So if you look at just direct spending, the government is consumer, like you and me. It actually peaked in 1968 at about 12% of our GDP was spent by the government buying things. It was as low as 5.8% in the first Clinton administration, and has climbed back to about 8% under Mr. Obama as of the fourth quarter of last year. Again, this is the official government data. So as a matter of fact, in terms of direct government spending, if you exclude things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment, federal unemployment insurance, we're actually spending about 2/3 as much as we did in the 1960s. We're buying less things. We're transferring a lot of income, but we're buying less things. Right? If you look at U.S. defense spending as a percent of federal outlays, and we look at what is our government spending money on, you'll see that back in 1964, remember we were in Vietnam, we were spending about 46% of everything we spent was spent on defense. It fell to a low of about 23% in 1980. It rose to about 27% during the Reagan administration as we were trying to defeat the Soviet Union by spending them into oblivion. It fell to about 17%, the lowest level, 16.5%, again at the end of the Bush administration, beginning of the Clinton administration, up to about 21% in 2008, and it is expected to be about 19 or 18.5% as we wind down Afghanistan and Iraq beginning this year. If you look at Social Security, however, you'll see that grows from about 13 to 14% in the 60s to about 23% in 2000, and today is about 22% also. So it's been stable, actually falling a little as other things have been growing faster. What's been growing? Healthcare. Healthcare is exploding. From no more than about 1.5% in 1964 to no more than about 4.2% in 1988 to more than 1 in 10 federal dollars goes into healthcare, either through Medicare, Medicaid, or other health spending. So about 10% of all federal outlays are now going to health. So here's what's happened in terms of the shift in priorities. The red line here shows you how much we've been spending on defense. The blue line shows you how much we've been spending on Social Security plus health care. And you'll notice the two of them were almost equal from 1964 through 1988. We're spending about as much on Social Security and health care as we were on defense, or put another way, we're spending as much on defense as we were spending on Social Security and health care. You can think of one as most international and one very domestic. And then they diverge. And what grows are Social Security and health care. And that's why you hear in the debates, what are we going to do about Social Security? What are we going to do about Medicare? What are we going to do about the Affordable Care Act? Because this is what's growing. This is what's causing the deficits. This is what's causing the debt. And that's what got people worried, if for no other reason than it could affect our bond rating and destroy the city of Newton. So in sum, I think one of the key points that we want to keep our eye on all this semester is our idea of what government should be. The optimal role of government is a balancing act. Neither big government nor small government is inherently good or bad. Look at Sweden, look at Finland, look at Germany, look at us. If that government does what its constituents want at a price they're willing to pay. So whether we're spending 32% or 36% or 41% of our GDP on government has a lot to do with whether we like how that money is being spent. It's being spent on things that makes our life better, gives our kids greater chance, protects our country better, or whether we feel that that spending has been wasteful, inefficient, ineffective, money down the toilet. That's what this is really all about. So let's take a look at the roles of government. One of the things that I've been saying for a long time is that part of our problem, and we see it so much in Boston, is that when government is doing its job well, no one knows it. We take it for granted. And then when government screws up, or a single worker screws up, a firefighter on disability who wins bodybuilding contests, all of a sudden government seems like everything about government is bad, right? And we don't take into account that every day, every moment, including this exact moment, government is affecting us in 1,000 different ways. From the moment you wake up on a mattress that is safe and inspected, to the clean water in your shower, to the safe food you had with your cornflakes, to the transportation you took to work, to the fact that most of us get to work safely on safe streets, etc., etc., etc. So let's just take a look at some of the major functions of government. I am going to go through this amazingly fast, and you're going to miss most of it, but again, the slides will be up tomorrow. But we want the federal government to do all of the following: provide for the national defense, establish and adjudicate private property rights, that's our whole court system, most of it's tort law, ensure compliance with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, establish a national currency, we call it the dollar, provide for national economic policy to maintain economic growth, employment, and stable prices, that balancing act between growth and stable prices, provide for national infrastructure, transportation, communication, assure public health, collect taxes to pay for the federal government. We then want state government to do things. Provide for regional transportation, ensure public safety, provide for higher education, UMass Boston, Roxbury Community College, assure K-12 equity across municipalities, a point that the mayor was making. We redistribute a lot of money from all of us to places like Lawrence, much more so than we redistribute to places like Newton. Promote economic development, ensure public health, regulate the energy sector, protect the state environment, encourage the production of affordable housing, provide unemployment insurance, provide workers' compensation, and local government, ensure public safety, promote K-12 education, public health, regulate the use of property through zoning laws, promote local economic development, provide water and sewer services, regulate local private monopolies, Comcast, Verizon. Those are just a small part of what we want government to do, and we almost always take all of that for granted. And then some of us bellyache about government. Okay. So let's go even dive a little deeper. What are the agencies we use? So providing for the national defense, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard. the National Guard, the Special Forces, CIA, Missile Defense Agency, the State Department, Agency for International Development, AID, Arms Control and International Security, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, which gave us the internet, the Helsinki Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, that just put us on Mars again, the National Security Council. We also want the government to assist the private economy, establish rules for private property. Where those rules break down, the private market doesn't work. We see it in country after country. The Copyright Office, the Patent Office, adjudicate property disputes through our court system. Land, physical assets, intellectual property, the Commerce Department to regulate commerce, the Federal Reserve System to give us a stable currency, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to give us money, which we used to use and carry in wallets and purses. The Antitrust Division, Federal Trade Commission, the Bankruptcy Courts, Court of Federal Claims, the Economic Development Administration, Export-Import Bank, Farm Credit Administration, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to safeguard your $100,000 in your bank, Federal National Mortgage Association, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae, Federal Housing Finance Agency, Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. We want the government to provide basic infrastructure. Federal Highway Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Railroad Administration, the Transit Administration, the Maritime Administration, Amtrak, railway stations, local mass transit, commuter rail, U.S. Postal Service. We used to have something like that. Federal Communications Commission, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bonneville Power Administration, the Federal Maritime Commission. And we want the federal government and the state government, local government to enhance human capital and culture. Public schools, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, the Employment and Training Administration, vocational training programs, employment services, Commission on Fine Arts, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, the Library of Congress, the National Science Foundation. We want the government to provide for our health, the National Institutes of Health, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Food and Drug Administration, Food Safety and Inspection Service, Healthy Homes and Lead Hazard Control Office, Indian Health Service, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Takes dollars to staff all that. Most of their work invisible to all of us. And yet without it, my God, just imagine. Protect the natural environment, the EPA, our national parks, our national forests, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, Migratory Bird Conservation Commission. We want to provide information to our citizens. Go on the internet, go to the FDA, vehicle safety information, vehicle efficiency data, 32 miles per gallon. It's brought to you by the government. Agricultural Research Service, Agricultural Department, Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, and we want to provide for domestic safety, the FBI, Federal Bureau of Prisons, the police, firefighters, EMTs, building inspectors, courts, jails, prisons, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives Bureau, the Bureau of Prisons, Civilian Radioactive Waste Management, FEMA, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, Federal Mine Safety, Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the Federal Marshal Services, Mine Safety, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and Citizenship Services, Immigration Services, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Commission on Civil Rights, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, the Federal Election Commission. So what does government do for you? We fail to recognize more than 10% of all the things we ask government to do for us. If citizens understood all the things government does for us, would they be as quick to criticize government and ask to see it shrink? If citizens who argue for cutting government were given a choice, which agencies would they overwhelmingly wish to eliminate? Mr. Ryan, I heard the other day, is saying he would like to cut marginal tax rates, but he's going to broaden the base. And he was quizzed over and over again by our own Tom Ashbrook. Okay, Mr. O'Brien, Mr. Ryan, tell us, what do you want to, how are you going to broaden the base? Get rid of the homeowner interest deduction? Get rid of philanthropic contributions deduction? What do you want to do? He said, oh, well, we don't know. That will be a bipartisan commission. It's a very easy answer, but I'm hoping he's asked over and over again, because that's really the question. What do we want, and what will we pay for? That's what this is all about. So I want to finish tonight's lecture by going back to one of my favorite economists of all time, Arthur Oken. Arthur was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors for, I think it was John F. Kennedy, it might have been Lyndon Johnson. And in 1975, he gave a series of lectures which I think summed up the whole question of government better than any person has ever done it. I've taught this almost since the book came out in 1975. And the question was, what do we want political institutions to do, and what do we want the market to do? And he starts out, and this will set up all the rest of what we're going to hear this semester, about how we define two different kinds of institutions. One he calls political institutions. This is an economist talking. And he says political institutions fundamentally are institutions that provide universally distributed rights and privileges that proclaim the equality of all citizens. That's what political institutions do. They provide universally distributed rights and privileges, the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, that proclaim the equality of all citizens. And here are some of the characteristics of political institutions. They're acquired at no monetary cost. You don't pay, or have to pay, normally, they're transgressions, for the right to speak, the freedom of speech, or freedom of religion. Doesn't cost you $1.98, even at Costco, right? It violates what economists call the law of comparative advantage. People with a great stake in a certain right, freedom of speech, have no more right to it than others. Freedom of speech is really important to a professor, right? But actually I have no more right to the freedom of speech than anyone else in the country, although I might be willing to pay more for it if it were a market good. It's equal without regard to ability or intelligence. It's not distributed as incentives. If you're really good, it will allow you to speak your mind, at least in our country. It violates equity and freedom in that everyone must pay for a right regardless of who uses it. Can't be bought and sold. As a result, Arthur Oken has suggested that our rights, our political institutions, are actually inefficient from the point of view of an economist. Political institutions and rights are inefficient. And what he means by that is they preclude prices that would promote economizing. The reason why we have markets is that we put prices on things so that people don't buy too much of it and exhaust it. Freedom of speech. We don't put a price on it. You can say almost anything in this country and get away with it. You'll see it in this campaign. Since there's no price for free speech, too many people use it too freely. It violates the law of comparative advantage. We academics, as I said, are so smart. We want the freedom of speech maybe than others, but we have no more right than somebody who flunked elementary school. Incentives, it precludes incentives that would augment socially productive effort. We don't use them as incentives to get people to do things, right? Speech were a market good, people would work harder to obtain it. And trades that potentially would benefit buyer and seller alike are precluded. So the starving person cannot trade his vote normally for a loaf of bread, even though after the trade, both people would be better off. I get to vote twice for my candidate, you get a loaf of bread. From the point of view of economics, that's ideal. We don't allow it. Then there are economic institutions. They're markets. Well, we rely on market-determined incomes that generate substantial disparity among citizens in material welfare. Some get rich, some get poor. Some get very rich. And then there's some who get very, very, very rich. Differentials in income, however, serve an important purpose. I expect Mr. Romney to say something like this during the campaign. They're meant to serve as incentives, rewards, and penalties to promote efficiency in the use of resources and generate growth in output. Market goods provide incentives. The most important being, work hard. Well, get an education first, here at Northeastern. Work hard, you'll get higher income, which will allow you to buy more things. Don't get an education at Northeastern, go to another school maybe across the river. Don't work quite as hard, and you're not going to be able to buy as much. He says there's a big trade-off here between political institutions and economic institutions. Equal rights and unequal incomes generate a tension between the political principles of democracy, everyone treated equally, and the economic principles of capitalism, those who are most successful get the goodies. But he doesn't think this is a fundamental inconsistency. He says this is an uneasy compromise. I love that term, right? But what for me it means, the battle that the mayor was talking about, the battle between Obama and Romney over market goods and political institutions. What do we want in the market? What do we want in political institutions? Is constantly in flux. Let me just add, why do we want rights? Well, one is just the whole question of liberty. People should be free. You want to basically protect the individual from the encroachment by the state. When the founders of this country wrote the Constitution, they put in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights protected individuals from the state, from the government. So the freedom of speech, universal and identifiable criteria used rather than discretionary. We have the ACLU, we have the court system upholding the rights to say some pretty horrible things to most of our ears. But we do that to make it universal. The whole idea of pluralism. Rights are a protection against the intervention of the market in everything we do. And the example he uses, if we could sell Olympic medals, what would Michael Phelps's 16 medals mean? And just basic humanism, the stress on human dignity, mutual respect without a quid pro quo. So the real question then is, how far should we go in ensuring rights? I've been talking about freedom of speech. I've been talking about freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. But how about things like right to health care? A right, not a market good, distributed equally. The right to a job, the right to safe housing, the right to food. Over time, we have battled over whether this should be a market good or a right. And you'll see what I mean. Free speech, free public education, most of us agree on that. The right to pollute, free housing, public welfare, right to a job, all of those things are, right? And we prohibit the sale of rights, which may mean that we're encroaching on individuals' freedom. I'm starving, I'd like to send my 12-year-old out to work, the state won't let me. Minimum wage laws, I'm willing to work for you for $4 and change, but the state tells me $8 an hour. So I don't get the job? Unfortunately, even when we have rights, we get transgressions against rights. We presumably are all equal before the law, but we know some can afford better lawyers than others. Citizens United, the whole idea of being able to buy votes with dollars, or the ability to lobby. So finally, the way to think about it, and this is not Oken, this is Bluestone's interpretation of Oken, is think about a spectrum, a continuum, from rights on one side to market goods on the other. And just to keep in mind, again, his definition of rights, something that doesn't involve any incentives, no quid pro quo, no this for that, and it proclaims the equality of all people. And market goods, again, in this abstract, used explicitly as incentives, always requires a quid pro quo, often in terms of dollars. Buy this for $12.82, and inevitably leads to inequality. Okay? So here's on this continuum where we might put the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of religion. Here's where we put market goods, and I often ask people, what would be the ideal market good, something that no one should ever have unless they can pay for it? The only one I could come up with is diamond pinky rings. Okay? That seems to me nobody should have one of those unless they can afford it. But then we have to ask the question, where in between these things will other things be? So let's take a look at food. In the 1920s, food was overwhelmingly a market good. During the 1930s and the New Deal, we had the county welfare worker who would distribute commodities like powdered eggs and lard and Spam to people who couldn't afford their own food. And so food moved from being a pure market good to being kind of a partial right. But I can tell you that powdered eggs, powdered milk, and lard is not T-bone steak. And then we went to the food stamp program in 1960, and we gave people greater rights, greater freedom to eat. And in fact, if you wanted to buy T-bone steak, you could. It wouldn't stretch your budget very far, but you could do that, right? Let's take a look at housing. Housing at one time was a pure market good. We then had public housing, big public housing projects, many of which failed miserably. Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago. And then we went to Section 8 housing with vouchers, which allowed you to choose where you'd live and be partially subsidized in terms of your rent payments. We moved from pure market good on housing, shelter, to public housing. You can have some, but we'll tell you where to live, and it's in this project, to Section 8, which gave you a greater right, greater freedom to choose with a government subsidy. How about home ownership? Absolutely a market good, but then we have FHA, VA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mae, the mortgage interest deduction, which said the government wants you to buy a home and will help subsidize you to do that, and therefore we had it not quite a right, but it wasn't quite a market good. And then home ownership, diminished Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac may disappear. Mr. Ryan may, in fact, in the back of his mind, be talking about getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction and go back away from it being a right to being a more of a pure market good. Healthcare, 1950, 1960 with Medicare and Medicaid, 2010, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Where are we going to go? More a right? We're back to a market good. Job. Where will jobs become something that should be a right of people? How much should the government work to produce an economy that's growing fast enough so more people can be employed? So, freedom of speech, and then we get Citizens United, which says that speech in some cases is a market good. If you can afford it and you're rich, you have more free speech than others. So I would argue that all of political discourse and everything we're going to discuss here is going to be where we are on that market versus rights continuum. Whether we're talking about fiscal policy, monetary policy, industrial policy, trade policy, labor policy, healthcare, you name it. Where do we want to be on that continuum? I would argue conservatives, including Mr. Romney and Mr. Ryan, are favoring the market goods end. They would agree with that. I would say that liberals, including Mr. Obama and Mr. Biden, are in favor of expanding rights. They talk about hope. They talk about opportunities. Different places on the continuum. And that battle is perhaps more divisive than ever. And that gets me to my last point before our break. And that is, I've been active more or less in politics since I first saw John F. Kennedy address and open his campaign in Detroit, Michigan in 1960 in Cadillac Square. So that goes back a few years. I was 16 years old. And I've watched politics very closely, despite the fact that I'm an economist and not a political scientist, but I can't recall a time, even in the Goldwater-Johnson election, in which the politics were so divisive. And I've tried to ask the question, as a scientist, as a social scientist, why? And here's the answer, okay? How many of you can tell me who that is far left on the top? And in the middle? It's actually Howard K. Smith. And over here? And then most beloved of all? Okay. How many don't know that? Wow. Okay. That's what I grew up with. And what was important about that is those were the people who gave us the news. They were the only people who gave us the news. Because we only had 3 networks. There was no cable. There was no Fox. There was no CNN. There was no C-SPAN. There was no MSNBC. And the result was that every one of them became an icon in the sense that they recognized they had to appeal to the broad spectrum of America. And thus, they gave us the news pretty straight. Pretty straight. Okay. Who are these people? Over here? Far top left? Bill O'Reilly? Right. Now, technology, that wonderful new technology, allows everyone to tune into the news that they want to hear. That reinforces their own biases. So how many of you watch Jon Stewart? How many of you watch Rachel Maddow? How many of you watch Rush Limbaugh? Bill O'Reilly? Okay? You should be watching them, right? They're telling us the other side. My friend Robert Putnam, who teaches sociology at Harvard University, wrote a brilliant book some years ago called Bowling Alone. And I had an opportunity some 20-some years ago to address a crowd of, I think it was the 20th Century Fund at their retreat in Phoenix, Arizona. And he gave us the most fascinating idea of how society breaks down. And the example he used was entertainment. He says, you go back to the Wild West or the Midwest. How did people entertain themselves? Basically, it was over a barn raising usually. Everybody in town got together, they raised a barn for Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and then they had a square dance. And what was right about the square dance? Well, the musicians are in the room, it's all live, and you're square dancing, which means you dance with every other person on the floor. Do-si-do, bow to your partner, etc. Later we get vaudeville. Vaudeville is live. The entertainers are here, the audience is there, you're interacting, and everybody is together watching the vaudeville show, right? Then we get movies. Movies, we still got everybody in the auditorium just like this, but those people aren't live. They're on celluloid, right? Then we get TV. Now you aren't in the theater, right? When I was a kid, I was there with Mom, Dad, and my 2 sisters, and we were watching Walter Cronkite. We were all watching the same thing, and our neighbors across the street were all watching the same thing, but we weren't doing it together. Right? And then we get cable TV. Then we get the internet. Everybody can go into their own blog. You can go into mine. You know, Barry Bluestone, Boston.com blog, Economy and Equity, and you can see my position or see somebody else's. And I think what's happened is that technology has allowed us each to get exactly what we want, which is exactly what economists say is the best of all possible worlds, where everybody can get exactly what they want. But what does it do to the social fabric? What does it do to political dialogue? And my argument would be the reason why we have such a flashpoint in this election and why the passions are so high is that nobody's listening to anybody